Okay. Ingrid, all yours.
Good evening, everybody. The dictionary says that folklore means traditional beliefs. Belief is straightforward enough, but traditional is a tricky word, implying something passed down without explaining how long ago the passing down should have taken place. It seems churlish to exclude recent beliefs such as milk is bad for you, just because they're passed down quickly via the internet rather than over centuries via an ancient crone. Still, the definition sounds fine until you have a look at Wikipedia and see the vast range of subjects covered by these apparently simple words, everything from animals to yodeling, with folk beliefs about food forming a particularly floriferous branch. This being the case, I am limiting this talk to considering certain beliefs relating to a basic range of foods that were eaten in the British Isles during the last 4 centuries. It is an irony of the subject that those who collected folklore until relatively recently were not usually the folk, but the well-educated middle classes. The very word was not coined, first slide please, until an antiquary, W.T. Toms, suggested it in an 1846 letter to the Athenaeum. There he is. Until the rise of social sciences in the 20th century, written record of a particular belief often survives only in the notes of a local vicar, though Tom's contemporaries also included serious antiquarians who produced large tomes of customs and curiosities or popular antiquities, usually somewhat spoiled by their authors' obsessive attempts to trace all customs back to the Bible, the Greeks, the Romans, or even the Druids. They write about working people as if describing an obscure, rather stupid jungle tribe. Clearly, such literary sons of empire no longer had the personal experience of the folk that had been common even 100 years before. Their sense of superiority is unpleasantly palpable. Folk beliefs here, as in other countries, are mainly concerned with preventing or curing sickness, and by analogy, averting bad luck. In the present day, folk beliefs are more concerned with acquiring health rather than avoiding sickness, a subtle difference. They are also consciously, modern beliefs this is, consciously contradict widely held scientific findings. COVID vaccinations make you infertile, being the latest. In a world much more unpredictable than our own, the people of the past were always struggling to find a stable foothold. Whereas you could never be sure that most of the things you ate might not make you ill, the folk belief that certain foodstuffs were basically always good, almost sacred, you might say, was reassuring and gave a sense of control. Bread, salt, milk, and spring water, you could rely on them. They were our allies. Even better, as well as being familiar foodstuffs, they could, because of their intrinsic power, be transformed into homely cures by the simple addition of magic words and rituals. Next slide. Folklore appears to have very little to say about the theory of the humours or the practice of bloodletting. Here we are, here they are, bloodletting this lady, which was the basis of most medicine until the late 18th century. Pre-scientific medicine may have been misguided, but it was the study of learned, literate men, and it's hard to say how familiar with its principles ordinary illiterate people were. We may be giving too much emphasis to written accounts. In any case, the poor, who couldn't afford the somewhat dubious attentions of a professional doctor or the expensive ingredients of their remedies, had to use whatever they had to hand. Besides, no doctor had a cure for bad luck, curses, or being overlooked by a witch. At least you could rely on bread. As a previous speaker in this series has mentioned, bread was the main foodstuff for the poor. It was the staff of life. So this is the first subject I'm talking about is bread. Next slide. Recent archaeological discoveries in Jordan have found the earliest evidence for the making of bread. 14,000 years ago, well, I think this is contested, but anyway, long before the beginning of agriculture. It has been with us through Western history, as rice has been through Eastern history. For the last 2,000 years, thanks to it being broken at the Last Supper, bread has also had a Christian context, which has enhanced its special power as one of our most important foods. Wasting or misusing bread came to be seen as a symbolic attack on life itself, almost blasphemous, one that would probably lead to inevitable punishment and starvation, the perpetrator deprived of the daily bread of the Lord's Prayer. There is a folk tale of a mother who, unable to bear the thought that her dead baby would lie in the cold grave with no shoes, makes it some out of bread. Subsequently, she is haunted night after night by its weeping ghost, which has been unable to get into heaven because of her action. And one of my grandmothers-in-law was in service during the 30s, and she said that her other servants really disliked Edward VIII, the man who became Edward VIII, because when he was Prince of Wales, he had been found in the royal kitchens playing football with a loaf of bread, and so they knew he would be a bad king. Although getting enough bread to live on was the main preoccupation of the poor, a proper respect for bread involves, as the youngest son in any folktale knows, the obligation to share it with others. In stories, this leads to good luck. In real life, it reinforced social ties. Furthermore, just keeping a crust in your pocket, according to folklore, will protect you against creatures of the other world or even the devil himself. It was the one thing that in the 19th century Ireland would protect you against the fea gorta, the deadly grass that ensnared anyone who stepped on a spot where someone had died of hunger in the potato famine. Without a crust, you would remain forever rooted to the spot until you too starved to death. A bit of crust protected your churn against milk-stealing witches, your cradle from changeling. In fact, a bit of crust was a sort of universal insurance against harm in general. Next slide. Bread's purifying power was used to remove the sins of the dead at funerals right up until the 19th century, particularly in Wales. This is not a very good picture, but I've done my best with it. It is a picture of a funeral. You can see the coffin there with the skull and crossbones on it and a little boy patting it. The ceremony is described in John Aubrey's wonderfully entitled The Remains of Gentilism and Judaism, 1686 to 87. A loaf, some salt and a bowl of drink were passed by a relative across the coffin to a volunteer, usually a poor person, the sin eater, who by consuming them took on the sins of the dead person and thus prevented them from ghostly walking. What happened to the eater isn't clear, but it seemed that people avoided them because they were now bad luck. He doesn't look particularly poor, but oh, he's got a stick, so that must be because he's a poor person. Bread in some form was an essential part of most celebrations, though as the years passed, it was enhanced with fruit and sugar, gradually turning into cake. Traditional things like hot cross buns, bride cake, funeral biscuits, groaning cakes, soul cakes, 12th night cakes, gingerbread, and so on, all began life as variants of bread. Next slide, please. And as such, they tended to combine some of the magical good luck power of their bread ancestor with whatever was special about the occasion. What bridesmaid hasn't heard about putting a slice of wedding cake under her pillow? This is a bride cake, symbolically cut, as you can see. In the past, this power was more strongly believed in, which is why you might once have found old hot cross buns carefully preserved in a cupboard. They, or indeed any bread baked at Easter, was thought to have the power of healing, and one was often kept to be grated into milk for stomachache or placed in the rafters to protect the house from fire. Sailors took them on board to guard against shipwreck, and they were hung up in stables to protect animals. In case you're wondering about the shelf life of such buns, you'll be pleased to know that bread or buns baked on Good Friday can never go mouldy. Pieces of groaning cake, made to restore the mother after giving birth, might be given to family and friends when the baby was christened to ensure its health and prosperity. The Struan Michael was a special cake made in Scotland on September the 28th, St. Michael's Day, to be eaten after the traditional Michaelmas ram lamb feast. It was made of equal parts of all the different types of grain grown on the farm, kneaded with butter, eggs, and sheep's milk, marked with a cross, and cooked on a stone heated with a fire of oak, rowan, and bramble. Sometimes a piece was thrown onto the fire to placate the devil, Michael's old adversary. Back to bread. According to Andrew Boord's Dietary of Health, 1547, he was a doctor in the Tudor time. One should be very careful of the type of bread one eats. Mixing wheat with other grains, though a very common practice at the time, reduced its health-giving abilities, according to him. It may fill the gut, but it shall never do good to a man, presumably because the strength of the wheat has been adulterated. He is also particularly against old and stale bread, which doth dry up the blood and natural moisture in a man, and doth engender ill humours, and is evil and tardy of digestion. Wherefore is no surfeit so evil as the surfeit of eating naughty bread. Not for him the magic of the pocket crust. Next slide, please. Of course, before you get bread, you first have to grow wheat. And as befits a magical substance, folk beliefs about its harvesting were extensive. It must be understood, however, that most of the records of harvest practices we have are fairly recent. Harvest was such a familiar activity in centuries earlier than the 19th that no one felt it necessary to describe it or the beliefs that went with it until they started to disappear, of course. Most districts had their own traditions, particularly with respect to the cutting of the last wheat in the field, known rather sinisterly as the neck in Devon and Cornwall, and which, according to writers on agricultural folklore, the spirit of the corn was widely held to reside. Exactly how literally this belief was held by actual agricultural workers is probably too late to discover. It is a weakness of early folklore collections that the collectors' own beliefs influenced their work too much. Farming folklore has been bedeviled, next slide please, by enthusiasts of Sir James Fraser and the Golden Bough. It's still a widely accepted piece of 20th century folklore that the man who cut the last sheaf was sacrificed in the old days to placate the corn spirit. I would humbly suggest that not everything is about the death of the sacred king. A few moments' thought will reveal how devastatingly pointless it would be for any community in an age immeasurably less well populated than our own to dispose annually of a fit young man. Next slide, please. Death, however, there was. As reapers got closer to the end of the field, all the animals hiding in the wheat, rabbits, hares, mice, rats, would suddenly begin to rush out, thereby providing keenly anticipated bloody sport for the reapers. Were these creatures seen as representatives of the corn spirit or just a free meal? Perhaps both. The meaning of any tradition is less important to those who keep it than the tradition itself. Next slide, please. I just put this in because it's such a nice picture of harvest. It's Samuel Palmer, and it's a moonlight harvest. Whatever the truth of the matter, evidence that cutting the neck really was widely regarded as a chancy thing to do is clear, because some communities spread the danger by having the reapers throw their sickles all together at the last standing section of wheat. Even so, someone was bound to be the last, and there was a tension between whether this was good, bringing an end to the harvest, or bad, taking something from the land. In one area, the last man might be rewarded by being given the best seat at the harvest feast, but in another, he might be roughed up more or less playfully by his fellow reapers. What was done with that last sheaf, once it had been decorated with flowers and brought home in triumph, decorated wagons surrounded by singing harvesters, it varied with region. It might be hung up for the birds to share the harvest, turned into a corn dolly, next slide please, or threshed and ground and made into a harvest cake or bannock. Accounts from Orkney are particularly interesting, though they are mostly from the 1920s and represent traditions already declining. If you're interested, they're to be found in Sigurd Tauri's Orkney website. There's lots of stuff about Orkney folklore there. On some of the islands, the bicco, a straw effigy of a dog, bikya is Norse for bitch, was made from straw from the last sheaf and hung on the outbuildings of the last farmer to finish harvest. Latterly, it seems to have been an insult to his farming ability more than anything else, and was resented as such. It has been suggested that the Biko tradition owes its provenance to the Vikings, as the last sheaf was called the wolf in some Scandinavian countries. The bitch is a wolf substitute, wolves being scarce in the Orkneys. On Gauze, the man who brought in the last load was beaten on his bare buttocks with the rough end of a sheaf, given a bannock, and then chased by the other harvesters. If he escaped them, he could eat the bannock, a sizable item. If they caught him, they got it, and presumably the good luck of the corn spirit instead. A much more recent piece of folklore about wheat, still in circulation on the internet, is that of mummy wheat. This particular belief seems to have started by one Thomas Pettigrew, who in the course of his public demonstration of opening a mummy, explained to a wide-eyed audience how he had once planted grains from mummy wrappings and that they had germinated with amazing results. Although speedily refuted by the experiments of the Association for the Advancement of Science in 1840, the mummy wheat story resonated some deep chord in the public imagination and has never entirely died out since. Indeed, I remember being told it as a fact in my childhood. A modern variety of wheat called camelt, but known popularly as King Tut's wheat, was supposedly developed from a handful of grains taken by a US airman from a stone box in an Egyptian tomb and subsequently sent to a Montana wheat farmer who germinated them and made his fortune. Not true, of course. In fact, wheat loses its ability to germinate in a few years. Other seeds from Egyptian tombs, peas, beans, and oddly, morning glories have also been claimed to have been grown. So now we move on to salt. Just because something is a folk belief doesn't mean it's not true. Humans are remarkably good at finding things that help them survive. Bread fueled the expansion of the Neolithic population. It is indeed good, if not having quite the magic powers attributed to it. The same goes for that essential salt. Its importance in human health was known from the earliest times, and the getting of salt produced early trading routes. So essential is it that eating someone's salt became the metaphor for an enduring relationship, and bread and salt were, and may still be, in some places, offered to visitors as a sign of friendship. In these days of processed food, we worry about eating too much salt, but a diet completely devoid of it leads to coma and death. In folklore, salt, like bread, prevented and purified evil. This is a belief reaching far back into the prehistoric past and found all over the world. A dish of it stopped the dead from walking, tied people together in pledge-making rituals, and chased off witches who apparently can't abide it. You should put a few grains of salt on anything likely to be bewitched. And if you ever find yourself dining with someone who doesn't like their food salty, beware. Like bread, salt, blessed by frequent mentions in the Bible, could be kept in a pocket to protect the owner. It could be thrown after a departing person to cleanse their path. It kept away the little people. A spell in Ireland against the Sidhe requires you to lay out 3 parallel rows of salt and say the Lord's Prayer 3 times over each row. In Scotland, it might be sprinkled over nets and, unnecessarily, you would think, into the sea by fishermen to blind the fairies. From Scotland, too, comes the story of Rabbi Burns' first trip to his new house, preceded, as was the tradition, by the family salt box carried aloft on a Bible. Keeping the salt box on a Bible was common outside Scotland as well, though which was meant to protect which is hard to guess. A less amiable use of salt is the cursing of your enemy by putting salt on the grave of one of his relatives, or forcing an enemy, or in another version, a lover, to come to you by throwing salt into the fire for 3 Fridays in a row while reciting the following. It's not this salt I wish to burn, but XXX's heart I wish to turn. May he not rest or happy be until he comes and speaks to me. Spilt salt is a warning. As Sir Thomas Browne says in his 1646 work, Pseudodoxia Epidemica, the falling of salt is an authentic presagement of ill luck. Spilling it could foretell a family quarrel. For a salt cellar to fall towards you is particularly unlucky. And it may be that the falling salt represents the person about to fall into trouble. In his painting of the Last Supper, Leonardo shows that Judas has spilt the salt, foretelling both Christ's death and his own. Unfortunately, that picture doesn't actually seem to show the spilt salt. It must be further on. Can you move the picture? No, perhaps not. Oh, never mind. It is spilt, I can assure you. No. As well as avoiding knocking over the cruet, you should never help someone else to salt. Help them to salt, help them to sorrow, was the saying, tears being salty. And you should definitely not lend it to anyone in case they use it in magic against you. Most of us have heard of throwing spilt salt over one's left shoulder. I was taught this by my mother, and I still do it, even though I don't believe that I'm throwing it into the eye of the devil who waits behind my left shoulder to work me evil. Next slide. Yep, here's poor old Obama. He definitely needs to throw salt over his left shoulder, I feel. Though its antibacterial properties were not known until recently, salt was known to purify, and so was used in treating wounds and in other remedies. The saltwater gargle for sore throats was popular right up to the 50s, but for many in the past, its real strength was in preventing sickness brought about by witchcraft. The ideas of witches' ill will causing sickness was prevalent among the poor and ignorant long after they'd ceased to be believed by the rationalists of the 18th century. Salt on the threshold and window ledge helped keep them away. The next subject is milk. Next slide, please. Milk, with its associations with the loving care of mothers, always providing it's being kept free from filth by a diligent dairymaid, was another pure substance that could be relied on, whether it was from a cow or a woman. Women commonly breastfed their children for 2 or 3 years, but after that, ignorance about infant nutrition often meant that small, weaned children were badly undernourished. The possession of a cow meant that one's children and any weak family member throve better. Though, of course, cows only give milk when they have calves, not year round, so a milkless winter still had to be endured. Next slide. Many folk tales involve getting or losing the family cow, or the poor person's dream being the lucky recipient of a magical cow with an inexhaustible supply of milk, such as the dun cow of Shropshire. There is a particularly fine cow with red ears in a story from Callanish on Lewis. Its red ears are a sure sign of its otherworldly origin, and it comes out of the sea at the tearful prayer of a local woman just in time to save her 6 starving children. As in other stories of the abundant cow, the everlasting supply of milk is eventually lost because of the ill will of, yes, you guessed it, a witch, who, if you believe it, not just folk tales, but actual real legal disputes, were always trying to steal milk or turn it sour. According to folklore, milk should never be given away or sold on May Day. A little may be poured over the doorstep to preserve the luck of the house, but spilling it is bad luck. When a cow gives milk for the first time, some may be kept aside in a bronze basin to ensure the animal's continued productiveness. 3 drops from each udder may be passed through a ring when the cow is milked for the first time after calving, in order to ward off infection and cleanse the milk itself. If you were poor, the fear of your cow going dry or dying was a serious one. The modern equivalent would be losing your house. Protecting the cow byre required much hanging up of magical items like branches of rowan. Witches were bad enough, but both serpents and hedgehogs were believed to suck dry the teats of cows. It's no wonder that in living memory, farmers in Ireland blessed their cows at every milking. Bee stings are the colostrum produced by the cow in the first milk after giving birth. It is pink and strong tasting and is still regarded as a treat by some people. Like human colostrum, it prepares the newborn's stomachs. Its benefits were well known in the past, and it is still traditionally made into pancakes to share with neighbours. One of the blessings was supposedly brought to Ireland by the rule of Cormac Mac Art, an early High King of Ireland, was that all the cows of Ireland had their udders full of colostrum. Nowadays, it is known to stimulate the immune system, but in the past, it was just known as a generally health-promoting food, good for the sick. One of the less slide, please. One of the less well-known folk attributes of milk was its ability, that's the witches feeding their offspring, the toads, and I don't know what they are, they're toads and a sort of curious squirrel-like thing with milk mixed with her own blood. One of the less well-known folk attributes about milk is its ability to counteract magic. Being a pure substance like well water, it could be thrown over spell items to neutralize them. In the story of the Hand of Glory, there is a Hand of Glory. The clever maid realizes that only milk will stop the soporific magic of a Hand of Glory, a useful item cut off a hanged man, which is keeping her master and his son asleep. She throws a jug of milk on the hand, they wake, and so she saves the master's inn from a band of thieves. In folk cure, it is more often breast milk that is used than cows. One would like to think this was because women were thought to be higher than cows, but I have my doubts. It was thought particularly good for eye and ear infections, warts, insect bites, and sore throats. If a woman's milk is mixed with hare's gall and poured into the ear, it could cure deafness. A woman enduring a strong labour could be eased, it was asserted, by being given 4 spoonfuls of another woman's milk. Next slide. This is from actually a Carthaginian statue, and you can see that this goddess, I think it's Astarte, has been provided with holes from which milk no doubt flowed into that bowl for the grateful recipient to heal themselves. As breast milk does have antibacterial properties, it may be that at least some of these remedies worked quite well. The next subject is spring water. Water for everyday life was taken from whatever source was available, often polluted. The river, the pump, a water cellar, a conventionally dug well if you were lucky, or even a pond if you weren't. But people knew that bad water made you ill, and none of these options was pure or healing. They sensibly preferred small beer or later tea, both of which required being made with boiling water. Andrew Boord, whose trenchant views on bread we have met before, writes of water, "Water is not wholesome by itself for an Englishman." It makes him dull and heavy, apparently. He goes on to say that if the said Englishman wishes to add river water to his wine, it should be left to settle for 2 or 3 hours, then strained, boiled, and added after cooling. So serious purification of river water. Next slide, please. Quite different was the water of a natural spring, used for things that required purity, such as mixing cures or washing wounds and so on. An ordinary spring was a good thing to have locally, but if all failed, if despite all the crusts and salts, trouble still came and you and your children fell ill, there was one more time-honoured resource for the poor. Despite having fallen out of favour after the Protestant Reformation and being looked down on by the better educated, there were always the holy wells. Even if local vicars, terrified that paganism was rearing its ugly head, often tried to stop the tradition. These worshipping at wells had been going on for so long, and of course it was a big feature of Catholic England. Holy wells were and are places whose worship often goes far back into prehistory. Adopted very early by Christianity and with their guardians suitably Christianized by being given the names of saints, they retained among the poor their reputation for the healing powers of their water, which could be activated by the right rituals, prayers, and offerings. Next slide, please. This is, I can't remember where that one is, but you can see that in this case, this is the other one was sort of in this sort of built up, but this goes right down into the ground, as lots of local wells in Yorkshire do. Though many have disappeared, Britain is still awash with sacred wells, believed to cure one thing or another. Many people in the past probably knew of at least one local one. Some are surrounded with stone curbs to protect them from dirt or patients falling in. Some, like the eye-curing well of St Mary's in Pilloth in Powys, have steps down into the water. And I've been to that well, and it has their steps are extremely steep, and you have to be careful not to fall in. Some, like St Winifred's well in Wales or the spring at Bath, are impressive affairs and have pools in which the afflicted bathe. Some, like St Helen's well near Market Wheaton in Yorkshire, or the Old Wives' well in the North Yorkshire moors, are mysterious stone-lined holes from which the healing water flows. What they cured could change over time as one generation forgot. For example, the twin wells at St Mary's Shrine of Walsingham, once the most important shrine outside Canterbury, cured diseases of the head and stomach in the Middle Ages, but, no doubt shocked by the dissolution, degenerated by the 18th century into mere wishing wells. A list of all the things holy wells were thought to cure is a list of the health problems of the past. High among them is eye disease, an ancient British problem treated by the Romans in Bath. Then there are children's diseases such as rickets and whooping cough. There's infertility, toothache, lameness, insanity, and skin diseases. Getting to a well that specialised in your particular disease might not be possible, especially for women with families, and so travelling friends and relatives might be tasked with bringing some back for the use of the family. A bottle of some healing water or other was a common feature of many a mantelpiece in poor people's houses well into the 19th century. In fact, it was only 30 years ago that a friend of mine was asked by an old man to fetch a bottle of the waters at Pilloth if he happened to be going near there, because his eyes were bad. He said he needed some of the water. It had to be collected just after dawn to get the cream of the well. Needless to say, my friend obliged. Many of the rituals used to activate the wells are beginning to be forgotten by the end of the 19th century, probably because of the improvements in medical care. Enough accounts of earlier times remain to give an idea of what was done, however. Most visitations had to be made at night, and often to be completed in silence. The direction of approaching the spring was often important, as was the number of times it had to be circumambulated. Cures worked better on certain days, May Day being a favourite, the cures being done at midnight or dawn to get the cream of the well, while the rest of the day was given over to games and picnics. In Wales, there was a belief that water drawn from a well at midnight on New Year's Eve would turn to wine, which must have led to many a severe disappointment. The actual rituals varied, but often were quite complicated and hard of achievement. For example, one which took place at Madron's Well in Cornwall involved dipping children with rickets into the water, the dipper facing the sun, and then passing them around the well from east to west and laying them on St Madron's bed, a stone slab in a nearby ruined chapel. The child fell asleep. If the child fell asleep and the water in the well bubbled up, it was a good sign. As all this was supposed to be done in silence, it wasn't just a good sign, it was a miracle. Another, recorded in the Silver Branch by F. Marion McNeill at Willie's Muir in Scotland, involved a group of infertile women silently kneeling at the edge of the spring, while an older woman threw cold water, first on their bare bellies and then on their bare breasts, 3 times 3. You will appreciate their toughness when I tell you it was once again done in complete silence. Each holy well had its own guardian, some invisible, some visible as animals, snakes, fishes, or even at St Michael's Well in Banffshire, a prophetic fly. If you were lucky enough to catch sight of the guardian, it might prophesy for you. The immortal Banff fly it was cleanly studied to see how it moved, and whether it's an action that you were planning on doing would be fortunate or unfortunate. In stories, the guardian of a well might volunteer to help the protagonist, though they could be touchy, as in the story of the maiden who, having insulted one, thereafter only spoke toads and snakes. Next slide. Nothing comes from nothing, and some sort of offering had to be made for the well's help. In ancient times, swords and gold rings were offered, but by the end of the period under consideration, a pin or a small coin was thought enough, though at Devil's Bridge you were expected to prick your finger with a pin first. Posies of flowers were sometimes offered, but elaborate well dressing, which seems to have been started in the 14th century at Tissington in Derbyshire, never became a widespread tradition. Though the poor now have purer water and better sources of health than holy wells, what are we to make of the recent British fetish for bottled mineral water? Health and purity, now marketable qualities, are still in demand, it would appear. And as for luck, the British continue to be inveterate water worshippers, dropping money into anything holding water, even supermarket water features. Next slide, please. Increasingly, pieces of ribbon are tied to trees near holy wells in imitation of Scottish clouty wells, where in the past rags dipped in the water were rubbed over an afflicted body part and then hung up to rot away, taking the problem with them. People didn't expect instant cures in those days, but what motivates people now? Perhaps they still want healing or luck, a sense of continuity with the past, or perhaps, as our own world becomes less stable, it's a silent request for help. Summary. Placebo is a wonderful and powerful thing, and no doubt the people of the past, as now, were cured by placing trust in many unlikely things. It is hard for us to imagine ourselves into the horrors of an existence in which life was so precarious. Finding a source of strength was essential, whether it was God, family, a crust of bread, or the benevolent bubbles of a well. During the 19th century, improvements in food and hygiene meant that there was a gradual abandonment of some less useful traditions. But despite the development of medicine and education, human troubles never end. And so new folklore springs up like weeds, including the ever-increasing number of strange beliefs promoted by that father of lies, the internet. Thank you.
Thank you. And where were we? Hang on. Bear with me a moment while I have that many things going on now.
Oh dear.
I'm busy trying to, where are we? There we go. Right.